And you mentioned a little bit about the miners' strikes. I think it's undoubtedly one of the main things that happened under Thatcher's rule, and I think it was outrageous. They wasn't mentioned at all when we talk about the Crown, and I think it's really important that we emphasize this. So I want to ask you, why were the miners' strikes so significant? They were not that long in time period, but like, why were they so important and so significant?
To understand the miners' strike, we've got to go back to 1972 and 1974. The British miners came out on strike twice around pit closures, but also around wages. And each of those national strikes were hugely successful in the sense that they drove back the Conservative government of the day. They won significant pay rises and concessions around working conditions. And the second strike in 1974, the then Prime Minister, Edward Heath, was so exasperated with the strike, which led to what was called the 3-day working week and actually power blackouts because of the shortage of coal as a result of the success of the strike. He called a snap general election, a bit like Theresa May recently, and said, "It's me or the miners." And unfortunately for Edward Heath, the country chose the miners over the Tories. And the Tories were thrown out of office, and we brought in a Labour government that was in power from 74 to 79. The significance of that strike can't be lost upon us, because the then Tory party, or some individuals within it, particularly a gentleman called, not a gentleman at all, but a member called Nicholas Ridley, who was later knighted, wrote a secret document which was called the Ridley Plan. And in that he said, our party can never once again suffer at the hands of the National Union of Mine Workers. And he wrote a document outlining how the NUM could be defeated in future battles. They created what in effect was a national police force. They brought in restrictions on picketing. They made it possible for people to drive lorries, which would ultimately be scab lorries, without having licensed vehicles. They withdrew all benefits for striking miners. And they also stockpiled coal. Now, it's similar really to what happened in the run-up to the 1926 general strike, when it was clear that the employers were preparing for an offensive. And it was clear to anyone that wanted to see that the Tories were preparing for an offensive against the miners. In 1981, there was a rash of unofficial strikes across the mining community when some closures were announced. Thatcher retreated because she wasn't ready at that stage to take on the miners. All of their ducks weren't in a row. And it was only in 1984 when the Tories announced pit closures, and they put in control of what was then the nationalised industry, the National Coal Board, a gentleman called Ian McGregor, who came over from America, whose job was to axe the coal industry. They announced some pit closures in 1984. The Yorkshire coalfield came out on strike straight away in solidarity with their comrades in Barnsley, and that strike spread throughout the whole of the country. None of us realised at the time that that would be a year-long strike, but the National Union of Mine Workers were the vanguard of the British working class. They were the strongest union in the country by far. They had huge economic, industrial, and also political power inside the Labour Party, aided by the fact that the left-wing firebrand Arthur Scargill had been elected as president of the NUM. And the scene was set for a huge struggle that lasted for an entire year. Now, McGregor later wrote his memoirs where he said that Thatcher was ready to concede to the miners. I would say probably about 3/4 of the way through the strike. And he persuaded her to stand firm. But at that stage, Thatcher was preparing to concede. Given that the ruling class had prepared so well, you would and should have expected that our leadership in the form of the TUC and the Labour Party should also support the miners, but that was woefully lacking. Kinnock condemned picket line violence, which was later shown to be perpetrated by the police, and Kinnock was then the leader of the Labour Party. Norman Willis, the leader of the TUC, likewise condemned picket line violence and refused to call solidarity action. When the dockers came out in support of the miners, they were advised to go back to work by their leadership. Socialists such as ourselves organised solidarity groups for the miners. There was international support for the miners, From France, they sent 7 lorry loads of goods and supplies to sustain the miners through the struggle, mostly of food, for the food kitchens that were set up by the miners' wives. A huge movement of the miners' wives developed through that year, which was an inspiration to us all. Miners went speaking all over the world to build up solidarity from America to Russia. It was the touchstone of the workers' movement. But the miners were left isolated. There was a group of miners who continued to work in Nottinghamshire. They set up a scab union called the Union of Democratic Mine Workers. And that was a wedge that was used by the ruling class to begin to demoralize those miners who were out on strike. Also, regrettably and unfortunately, it came to light later that the MI5 had penetrated the leadership of the NUM, and one of their leaders, who was a security spy, was reporting all the dialogue and discussions of the NUM back to the ruling class. And little by little, through police violence, they penned the miners back in their coal fields, and a trickle then became a flow of miners going back to work who didn't feel they could win the struggle. And so ultimately in 1985, after a year-long battle, they marched back to work without a settlement. That was a tragic defeat for the working class. We can't emphasize that enough. But as a result of that defeat, it meant that the trade union movement was muted and unable really to galvanize the forces that would be necessary to resist the onslaught that the ruling class then threw against the rest of the working class as they began to take on other major sections of the working class, like the dockers, the engineers, the car workers, and so on.